In the year 1890, the Ozark Mountains stood as a rugged frontier of silence and shadow. The rolling ridges stretched endlessly, clothed in forests thicker than walls, their canopies swallowing light like a mouth that never closed. Streams cut jagged paths through limestone, and mists clung low to the valleys at dawn, curling between trees like restless spirits. To those who called it home, the Ozarks were both shelter and prison, majestic in beauty, merciless in hardship. It was a place where stories ran faster than rivers. Around firelight, in cabins built from rough-hewn logs, people whispered of things better left unspoken. Wandering figures spotted on moonless nights, cries carried through the wind from empty hillsides, and caves that breathed as though alive. The land fed men when tended properly, but it devoured them too when they strayed too far. Among the many stories, none cut deeper into the hearts of locals than that of Stonewell Cavern. Stonewell was no marked location on any county map. Its entrance was said to be nothing more than a ragged tear in the hillside, difficult even to stumble upon unless one knew precisely where to look. Yet despite its secrecy, the name passed from mouth to mouth like a fever. Farmers, preachers, mothers, and hunters all spoke it softly, as though the word itself could wake something slumbering beneath the stone. The year 1890 would be scarred not only by hunger and harsh winter, but by the beginning of disappearances, ones that gave Stonewell Cavern an identity more terrifying than any ghost tale. It began with 3 local men: Elias Carter, a farmer hardened by drought; Jonathan Pike, a trapper with a knack for reading animal signs; and William Boone, a young father barely past his 20s, who had begun hunting to feed his growing family. None were reckless men, nor strangers to the dangers of the hills. They were carved from the land itself, men who knew when to take risks and when to hold back. On an October morning, with the air sharp as broken glass and the scent of wood smoke floating through the valley, the 3 left town together. Their rifles were strapped across their backs, and their boots sank into the damp leaves covering the trail. To neighbors, they were hunters chasing game before winter set in. But what lingers in the accounts, retold in fragments and whispers, is that their direction led them toward the ridge where Stonewell Cavern was rumored to lie. No one can say for certain what they sought. Some believed they wanted richer hunting grounds and traps filled with fur. Others suspected something far stranger: treasure, perhaps, or an entrance to new veins of iron rumored to lie hidden beneath the hills. And still others swore the men had been tempted by the cavern itself, by whispers of strange happenings unfit for daylight talk. That night, none returned. When the sun rose the next morning, Elias' wife stepped outside their cabin, waiting for the sound of boots on the path. Jonathan's traps remained empty, unset, and William's young child clutched the window frame, waiting for a shadow that would never reappear. Days passed. Neighbors searched the hillsides with lanterns, calling until their voices bled into hoarse silence. Dogs refused to track the scent past a certain ridge, whimpering and pulling back against their leashes. No rifles were recovered, no scraps of clothing snagged on brush, not even a broken boot print to prove where the men had gone. It was as though the forest had swallowed them whole. And then the whispers began. At first, they seeped in between conversations, hints that the men had strayed too near Stonewell Cavern. Some said they heard cries in the night echo across the ridge. Others swore that glowing lights flickered near the cavern's hidden mouth. By the end of the week, no one mentioned hunting accidents anymore. The conclusion came like a slow dawn. Stonewell had claimed them. The cavern's reputation darkened. Its opening, jagged and narrow, was said to release air colder than any frost, air that smelled faintly metallic, like rust or blood. Those who dared to describe its walls spoke of deep grooves carved into the stone, marks like symbols, precise and unnatural. But most unsettling of all were the sounds. Those who lingered near its opening claimed to hear footsteps when none walked, or whispers carried from just out of sight. Some swore it was chanting, steady and low, masked by stone and darkness. What began as tragedy quickly became dread. By winter's first frost, no villager dared climb near the ridge. Mothers pulled their children close, and men whispered prayers louder than their courage would allow. Stonewell, once an unspoken rumor, became a name they dared not linger on too long. But silence sharpens curiosity. Sin thrives in whispers, in secrets traded behind shut doors. And so, hidden beneath the weight of grief, a sickness spread. People began to wonder not only what drew the three men there, but why the cavern had taken them so absolutely. What did it keep inside? What did it hide? The land grew heavier in their absence. Even the forest seemed changed, quieter, the air denser. Some claimed the ridge itself looked darker when glimpsed at dusk, its silhouette more jagged than the others. And then the valley faced something it could not ignore. On a pale morning, the snow thin but stubborn on the hillsides, the hawthorns discovered that their son was missing. Samuel, 15, restless and bold, was last seen before dawn walking into the woods, his boots crunching frost as he carried a small satchel. In younger days, he was known for climbing too high or fishing too far, for chasing curiosity where others kept restraint. But this time, the path he left told a story too deliberate. Neighbors followed his tracks into the woods until they wound toward that same ridge. But just as before, they ended abruptly in the brittle leaves, vanishing as though the boy had been lifted from the earth entirely. Samuel was never seen again. Not a thread of fabric, not a whisper of breath returned. The grief was unbearable, but the fear was sharper. 3 hardened men gone, and now a boy taken by the same shadow? Families no longer whispered but shouted in anger, demanding answers no preacher or elder could give. The cavern's name was no longer a warning. It was a sentence, a place that swallowed and never yielded. By year's end, the village could no longer deny what gnawed at them in sleepless hours. Stonewell Cavern was not mere rock. It was hunger, a hollow in the earth that stole the living without trace. And whispers grew heavier, curling like the smoke of dying firelight. Some called it cursed. Some called it the devil's doorway. All agreed it was waiting. And in that winter of 1890, as snow veiled the Ozarks in silence, the people of the valley understood a truth they could never forget. The cavern was not just there. It was watching. This was only the beginning. The year 1891 dawned with a bitter chill across the Ozark Mountains. Snow lay like a thin shroud over the valleys, and the bare branches groaned under the weight of ice and wind. For the community that lived in the shadow of the hills, the silence was heavier than the cold. It was a silence left by those who never returned: Elias, Jonathan, William, and now young Samuel Hawthorne. Their names no longer belonged to the living, but to whispers, etched into every conversation, yet never spoken too loudly. The disappearances had settled on the valley like a sickness. The smallest noises became threatening: an owl cry mistaken for a scream, or the echo of branches cracking in the wind whispered as footsteps in the dark. Doors were locked earlier. Children were kept inside. And still, even in hiding, fear seeped into every cabin, every table. No one knew when Stonewell might awaken again. For weeks after Samuel vanished, the villagers clung to desperate hope. They combed the hills, lanterns swinging low, rifles strapped to their backs. Search parties stretched into the ridges, following faint trails, hollows, and dry creek beds. Yet every road led to the same place, the ridge where Stonewell Cavern was said to breathe. And there always the signs ended, snuffed out like candlelight. The older men in town, men with shoulders stooped by years of farm work, warned others not to push further. "It don't want finding," one muttered, hands trembling on his walking stick. "It wants taking." The younger men, brimming with anger and grief, called them cowards for saying such things. But few dared argue when it came time to press into the cavern itself. They would stop before its jagged mouth, their lanterns flickering, their stomachs twisting. And every time, the searchers turned away. It wasn't that they agreed with the old men. It was that their very bones resisted stepping forward. No one could explain what held them back. The air, whenever they neared Stonewell, felt colder, and not merely frost, but a cold rooted deeper than the skin, creeping into marrow. Horses balked before the ridge, their nostrils flared, ears pinned flat against their heads. Dogs refused to follow their masters into the tree-line. And the few who managed to force themselves close came back pale and changed, unwilling to say exactly what they felt, only that the cavern watched them as much as they watched it. By spring, the grief that hung over the valley hardened into silence. Families spoke of their dead only when prayer forced them. Neighbors avoided the subject altogether. But though words stopped, eyes did not. From every window, every clearing, people glanced toward the hills. The ridge seemed different somehow, darker, sharper. At dawn, mist clung to it endlessly, trailing in tendrils that refused to lift with the sun. At dusk, shadows wrapped it tight, as though the forest itself turned its back and folded inward. The preacher at the town's church began preaching with newfound fervor. His voice rose over the crowded pews, declaring Stonewell, Cavern, an evil unworthy of God's land. He warned that those who perished had trespassed upon a cursed place, tempting God's wrath by stepping where no soul was meant to step. His congregation, trembling and weary, nodded, though no sermon erased the fact that wives were left widows and children fatherless. And behind their bowed heads, fear bloomed uglier than faith. For fear had another voice. Rumors, quiet but persistent, claimed the cavern was no accident of stone, but carved deliberately by men long before the valley was settled. Strange markings, etched into its walls, were repeated from memory by anyone who claimed to have glanced inside. Some whispered that the hunters saw treasure there or signs of something ancient, and were swallowed because they sought to take it. Others suggested the cavern was older than the mountains themselves, that it pulsed as a wound buried in earth, feeding when flesh dared come near. Yet no matter how dark the rumors grew, one truth remained unshaken. No body ever returned. As spring bled into summer, the stillness of the cavern cast new shadows on the community. Elias Carter's farm fell into ruin. Jonathan Pike's traps rusted where they lay abandoned. William Boone's child, no longer waiting by the window, sat silent for hours, as though expecting to hear his father's step on the porch once more. The Hawthorns stopped speaking Samuel's name entirely, as though silence could shield them from memory. In the evenings, when air grew heavy and still, lanterns burned late inside the cabins. Neighbors gathered not to pray, but to watch each other, fearful of being left alone. They listened closely to the wind, swearing they heard distant noises, knocks beneath the ground, like fists pounding from somewhere deep. Others claimed chants floated faintly down from the ridge at night. Each story frayed nerves further, tightening the valley's grip of dread. Isolation only sharpened the torment. The nearest township lay many miles away, and those few who traveled returned with little sympathy. To outsiders, the tales of Stonewell were dismissed as frightening folklore, a crutch for people too buried in superstition. But for those in the valley, there was no illusion. The missing were real, and the cavern remained no myth. They lived in the shadow of something the rest of the world refused to see. In midsummer, fear became suffocating enough that a decision was made. A gathering was held in the town square, lanterns hanging from poles as the warm night shimmered with insect song. The people debated in harsh whispers whether to leave. Some spoke of abandoning their land, scattering before Stonewell claimed again. Others shouted back that to leave was to surrender their lives without a fight. Voices rose, hands shook, tempers ignited. But in the end, no decision satisfied them. Fear, like soil, held them in place. And yet, though no search parties pressed deeper, curiosity remained intolerable to some. A small group of men began watching the ridge by night. They perched at the tree line, hidden, waiting to see if the cavern truly moved or breathed. At first, they reported nothing, only stillness, silence, endless shadow. But as days wore into weeks, they swore they saw movement near the rocks, figures shifting in outline just beyond their vision. Not animals, not men they could call by name, shapes, standing, then gone. One night, a witness returned shaking, his lantern shattered in his grip. He claimed he had seen Samuel himself, standing barefoot at the mouth of the cavern, staring outward with eyes blank as stone. No one believed him at first, not because they doubted his fear, but because they did not want to believe. The mother of Samuel collapsed when news reached her, clutching the empty air as though pulling her son back. From that moment, the whispers changed. The cavern did not merely take, it gave something back. But what it returned was not the same. By the year's end, the valley was at its breaking point. Some packed belongings, preparing to leave despite the shame of abandoning generations' worth of land. Others clung stubbornly, insisting faith would protect them. But through it all, Stonewell remained unchanged, jagged, silent, waiting. Its hunger palpable, but patient. The community understood a grim truth. Silence itself was the most terrible companion. No cry for help, no remains for burial, no certainty of death. Just absence. And absence became terror. And so the legend of Stonewell Cavern deepened. What began as whispers in the hills had become a shadow over every home, pressing closer with every season. And as the valley entered autumn once more, the people knew with certainty that the cavern was not finished. For silence never lasts. Autumn returned to the Ozark Mountains in 1891 with a cruel sharpness, painting the hillsides in red and gold, yet chilling the bones of those who lived in the valley. Normally this season brought harvests, fairs, and the sound of laughter carried through the crisp air. This year, however, laughter was in short supply. Families whispered to one another, as though someone listened from the darkened corners of their homes. And every breeze that rose through the pines seemed to carry an echo from the hills, an echo that unsettled and silenced all who heard it. The names of the lost had become prayers, repeated nightly with vacant stares. Elias Carter, Jonathan Pike, William Boone, Samuel Hawthorne. Their absences were not mere wounds, they were voids. Echoes where once there had been presence. And the wound that made them ache most was that no grave bore their names. Every day their families lived with the absence of bodies, the denial of mourning, the unrelenting silence of Stonewell Cavern. By the end of October that year, fear and grief became unbearable. The valley was divided. Some swore the community must abandon the land altogether, leave the cavern to swallow the hills unchecked. Others argued that leaving would only make Stonewell stronger, as though surrendering homes to fear would expand its reach. And amidst the turmoil, a small group of men decided that silence no longer sufficed. They made a decision, rash perhaps, but desperate. They would approach the cavern. The group consisted of four: Henry Lowe, a blacksmith with broad shoulders and soot permanently stained into his hands; Thomas Grady, a quiet farmer who lost his brother to one of the earlier disappearances; Jeremiah Quinn, a man of the cloth, though his faith had been tested sharper than most; and Andrew Wilkes, a mill hand whose courage often collapsed into anger. Together, they swore themselves to face the ridge directly. Lanterns would pierce where speculation never dared. It was late afternoon when they set out. The forest, once alive with animal calls and rustling underbrush, seemed muted as they walked. Leaves fell soundless, and even the squirrels darting between branches moved with eerie quiet. Their boots pressed into the soil, every step shockingly loud in the unnatural hush. The ridge rose before them, darker than the others, sharp stone teeth cutting upward against the horizon. Clouds thickened overhead as though drawn to it, and when they reached the tree-line at its base, each man paused involuntarily. It stood there, a black slit in the hillside, half hidden by brush, unmistakable at last. Stonewell Cavern. Henry was the first to raise his lantern, pushing aside branches until the beam shone into the mouth. The opening was larger than whispers suggested, tall enough for a grown man to step inside if he dared, though jagged rock framed it like the maw of some crouched beast. Cold spilled out immediately, rushing at them like icy breath, enough to make all four men shiver despite thick coats. Thomas held out his hand, brushing the stone wall. It was damp, slick with condensation, though no rain had fallen in days. His fingers traced deeper grooves, long, deliberate gouges cut into the stone surface. They were not cracks, not rough edges shaped by water or time. They were carved. Symbols, perhaps, though none could name them. Curving lines that bent unnaturally, intersecting in ways that carried no sense, no known language. Jeremiah muttered a prayer beneath his breath, But his voice faltered. It was not only the cymbals. It was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. Standing there, they expected to hear wind swirling within, water dripping, stone shifting. Yet it was silent. A silence so absolute that it made their ears hum, fragile and raw. "Listen," Andrew whispered suddenly, his face twisting pale. The others obeyed. And then they heard it. Faint, distant, low. A noise that did not belong to earth. At first, they thought it might be water moving far inside. But it wasn't. It pulsed with rhythm. Steady, repetitive, like words carried through hollow chambers, muffled yet patterned distinctly, almost like chanting. Lantern light flickered. A gust, or perhaps something else, pushed against them, and Henry stepped back, swallowing hard though he was the boldest of the four. Their courage, firm minutes earlier, drained with the sound. None entered. Andrew shouted suddenly into the opening, cursing into the darkness, as though to provoke an answer. The noise inside stopped, vanishing mid-beat. Silence rushed back even heavier. And though he yelled again, no sound came in reply except his own trembling echo. The men retreated, shaken. Not cowards running blindly, but men walking backward, unable to bring themselves to turn their backs on the cavern, convinced that if they did, something would follow. Lantern light wavered across their faces until the ridge was behind them, trees closing once more between them and the black maw of Stonewell. When they returned, their report fractured the fragile calm of the village. Henry swore the carvings in the stone were deliberate. Thomas swore he heard voices. Jeremiah refused to speak of what he heard at all. And Andrew, though he remained unsteady, declared the cavern alive and evil, demanding it be sealed or burned, as though stone could burn like timber. Their story spread like wildfire. At first, some villagers were curious, the bold thinking perhaps Stonewell had been exaggerated. But when they saw the faces of the men, jaw tight, eyes darting, they knew the truth. Something was inside. In the nights that followed, unease grew sharper. Women claimed to hear their children whispering strange words in their sleep, words that made no sense, yet sounded eerily like rhythm, like chant. Men swore that at dawn and dusk, when the sun cut low through the forest, a figure lingered on the ridge near the cavern's mouth. A man, perhaps, or the echo of one lost. None dared approach close enough to know. The greatest terror came not in the form of proof, but in signs, absence, silence, moments when the valley felt too still to breathe. Some spoke of animals fleeing the ridge entirely, no deer, no foxes, no sound of bird wings through the pines. The mountain itself had grown hollow. The preacher thundered louder in his pulpit, declaring a demon inhabited Stonewell. Men argued angrily at the town meetings, demanding the cavern finally be sealed by dynamite. But no one stepped forward to lay the charges. No hands were brave enough to be the ones nearest its maw when the earth cracked. And so talk remained talk, and the cavern remained patient. For Stonewell did not need to leave. Its power seeped outward, 1 inch at a time, as men grew paranoid, women grew restless, and children dreamed louder in their sleep. And as autumn withered into winter again, an unshakable truth found its place in the valley. The cavern would not wait forever. It had been stirred. It had tasted. And soon it would take again. Winter swept through the Ozark Mountains with a cruelty that bent trees into arcs of ice and left chimneys smoking around the clock. But for the valley, the true weight they carried was not the cold. It was the sense that the hills themselves had turned to watch them. After the 4 men returned from their approach to Stonewell Cavern, their silence spoke louder than anything they could say. They avoided questions from their wives, avoided sitting near firelight where their eyes might be studied too closely. Villagers who had known these men all their lives swore they were changed. Not broken, but bruised in some invisible way. Their movement slower, their laughter extinguished, their gazes fixed often on the tree line as though listening for something others could not hear. It was not long before others began to notice changes as well, small at first, then undeniable. At the Carter homestead, chickens began to vanish from their coop. Not torn apart as if by a fox, not an attack at all, but gone. No feathers, no signs of violence, just absence, as complete as the men who had disappeared. Soon it was goats. A single cow. Always without noise, without struggle. As though one by one they were being erased. At night, lights appeared on the ridge, faint glows shifting between the trees, moving slowly as though carried by hidden hands. Some swore they were lanterns. Others insisted they were not lanterns at all, but something brighter, burning without flicker. Men posted on their porches claimed to hear footsteps on the frozen ground just outside their cabins. Yet when they opened their doors, no tracks broke the frost. The absence of prints, against the weight of sound, hollowed out their courage. Sleep itself began to unravel in the valley. Children cried from nightmares they could not describe, waking with scratches on their arms where no nails had marked them. Adults whispered of voices calling them in the dark, indistinct but familiar, as if those thought dead still called from outside. And more than one villager admitted, with trembling confession, that they woke to find shadows in their rooms, shadows unmoving, darker than lantern light, silhouettes that vanished only when they screamed. The town tried to carry on with routine, plowing snow, cutting timber, mending wagons. But even in daylight, unease pressed close. Men spoke of their tools vanishing from sheds, found later days away, rusted and broken. Women claimed the well water, soured overnight, carrying tastes metallic and foul. Families whispered of animals staring into the forest for hours, silent, refusing to eat, as though awaiting signal from something deeper in the woods. And then the first villager collapsed. It was Margaret Wilkes, Andrew's wife. She fell suddenly while stirring broth at her hearth. No sickness, no fever, no warning. When neighbors rushed to her side, she gasped for air, eyes wide, mouth shaping words she could not release. Some swore her lips struggled around a sound, a chant low and guttural, strangled before breath failed her. Within an hour, Margaret was dead, her body stiff and cold as though winter had claimed her veins directly. The preacher wasted no words in declaring Stonewell had reached into their homes. His sermons grew louder, his voice raw from shouting. "It is not just the cavern," he thundered one night, fists slamming the pulpit. "It is here now. It lives where you sleep. It feeds where you work. And it will not stop until we drive it back into the earth." But drive it back how? Burn it? Seal it? Pray closed? Words shattered against silence, and men who once called themselves brave stayed quiet, for the preacher's rage stirred them. But every man still carried the echo of those who had vanished, and no one wanted to join them. It was Jeremiah Quinn, the shaken preacher who had stood at the cavern's threshold himself, who finally spoke quietly of what he believed. Standing before only a handful of villagers, his hands trembling, he admitted something none wanted to hear. "I don't think it can be destroyed. It is older than us, older than the ridges themselves. And every step we take toward it only wakes it further." The group said nothing. They had already suspected. Still, the realization spread through the valley like frost on a window. The cavern was no longer a wound contained. It bled outward now. The proof arrived weeks later, on a night of gray fog, thick enough that lanterns glowed only a few feet ahead. A scream split the valley. It came from the Quinn homestead. When neighbors rushed to the cabin, doors flung wide, they found Jeremiah's wife clutching their youngest son, blood smeared across her arms. The boy was breathing, barely, but his back was marked by deep scratches, long and parallel, as though clawed by something too deliberate to be animal. Strangest of all, no doors or windows were broken. The boy had been torn inside his home. The preacher's words spread by morning. Stonewell comes to us now. The valley no longer debated abandoning. They lived in fear not only of disappearance, but of corruption, that their very bodies might unravel under the cavern's shadow. Some swore they were next, chosen, marked. Families packed wagons in haste, dragging what little they could carry, leaving fields unmended, animals untended. But leaving was easier said than done. Caravans that tried to depart reported strange hindrances, wheels snapping without cause, horses rearing and refusing to move, roads wiped of direction by fog so dense it erased entire paths. Those who pressed further returned days later, both shaken and silent, admitting they had lost their way in woods they had walked their whole lives. The forest no longer obeyed memory. It had shifted, twisted against its own people. The valley became trapped in every sense. Trapped between fear and hunger, between silence and screams, between the impulse to flee and the impossibility of leaving. Still, though despair deepened, curiosity remained unbroken. Some argued that if the cavern could not be destroyed, it had to be understood. Knowledge is weapon, one man muttered, and better a weapon than none. But knowledge meant returning. It meant stepping once more to that ridged mouth, that silent maw waiting in the hill. Few dared. Through it all, one truth hardened inside every household. The eyes of the valley no longer belonged to the living. When children glanced out windows, they swore the trees blinked. When men traveled past a ridge, they swore the cavern shifted, shadows leaning forward as though to greet them. The mountains themselves had taken notice. Winter nights stretched long, endless, still. And for many, it became impossible to sleep without the same feeling. You were being watched. Watched not by neighbor or beast, but by the cavern itself. Stonewell had left its threshold. By early 1892, the fear that haunted the valley ceased to be whispers. It had become a voice of its own, loud, pressing, demanding. Too many lives had been erased into silence, too many homes had caved under grief, and the shadow of Stonewell Cavern stretched so wide that to ignore it was no longer possible. The villagers were weary of watching their families unravel, weary of beasts driven mad, of water spoiled, of nights punctured by footsteps with no forms attached. They were weary of waiting. Fear alone, they realized, would not stop the hunger that crept from the hills. So one bitter evening, a gathering was called. The townspeople crowded in the church, the only building large enough to hold them all. Lanterns sputtered weak light against frost-coated windows, the air thick with steam rising from damp coats. Men rubbed their hands raw against the cold. Mothers held children close as though to shield their ears, and voices clashed until the preacher stood to silence them. "You know why we're here," he began, his voice sharp, raw with weeks of shouting. "Stonewell is no longer a mouth on the ridge. It stalks us in our homes. It has stolen our brothers, our sons, our neighbors, and now it takes without crossing threshold. Evil does not wait for prayers. Evil devours prayers. And unless we act, there will be no one left to pray." His words burned, but so did his fear. Every face in the crowd reflected the same thought. Action was no longer a choice, but a demand. The debate carved itself across the night. Some insisted that sealing the cavern with powder and rock was the only way to stop it. If the mouth could not breathe, the hunger could not feed. Others argued in turn that such an attempt would only rouse greater wrath, that tampering with it would draw the valley into darker doom. Striking a beast sometimes only makes it strike harder. But beneath the debate was another voice, quieter, more dangerous, we must know. It rose from Thomas Grady, the farmer who had once stood at the threshold. His voice was steady though his eyes never left the floor. "We cannot fight what we do not understand. If we march to choke that cavern closed with blind hands, we will bury ourselves before the stone. If it is older than the hills, older than us, then it will outlast what little stones we throw against it. Knowledge is the only weapon. We must enter." The church fell to silence. The very word was poison to them. Step inside, pass into the black throat where 4 men and a boy had vanished clean, without trace? Every instinct screamed refusal, yet the logic gripped tighter with every passing second. How long could they circle silently, while the cavern pulled at their valley inch by inch? One voice broke the stillness. Henry Lowe, the blacksmith. His wife had left him that winter, taking their children away to her father's far miles across the mountains. He had nothing left but his anvil and the fear burning his every dream. And now, with hands scarred from fire, his voice rose in open challenge. "I'll go." The room stirred uneasily. Henry's eyes were hollow, but determined. "One cannot go alone," Thomas said, his jaw rigid. "No one can face it alone." Jeremiah Quinn, shaking but resolute, stepped forward next. "If it is evil, Then faith must walk with those who enter. If you go, then I go. A murmur swelled. Courage touched some like fire. By the night's end, 5 men stood willing. Henry Lowe, Thomas Grady, Jeremiah Quinn, Andrew Wilkes, and a man named Caleb Foster, quiet until then, but driven by the loss of his younger sister, a girl who had vanished without leaving even her name whispered among rumors. The villagers stared at their chosen, few the way one stares at condemned men. Pride battled with dread, but no one attempted to stop them. They were too desperate. Preparation began. The blacksmith provided tools, chisels, small hammers, picks. Lanterns were filled with every drop of oil the town could spare. Ropes were tied, knives sharpened though none dared say what use they might serve against the void. And each man carried something else, less visible, a piece of their grief, that burning need to face the mouth that had stolen, even if it consumed them in turn. On the night before their descent, the valley slept uneasily. Few closed their eyes. Men sharpened tools until their fingers bled. Women stood at windows, staring into the fog that blanketed the ridge. Even children seemed to sense something looming, lying awake in silence rather than crying. It was as though the entire valley was holding a single, fragile breath. Morning came gray. The ridge loomed darker than usual, cloud shadow draping the hillside in shade even while the rest of the valley glimmered in pale light. The 5 men marched with slow steps, their lanterns unlit until trees swallowed sun. Behind them trailed the rest of the village, though none dared approach the cavern itself. They stopped at the tree line, whispering prayers not for victory, but for mercy. The 5 stood alone at the threshold. Their breath steamed sharp against the air, hearts trudging unevenly. Henry's face was pale, but set. Jeremiah's lips moved with broken prayers. Thomas adjusted his lantern, watching the flame shimmer against damp stone walls. The cavern exhaled. Cold breath spilled outward, sharper even than the morning frost. And from inside, steady, rhythmic, came again that faint, terrible sound. Chanting. They stepped forward. The lantern light trembled against the jagged mouth. Henry muttered, "Once we cross, there is no turning." The others nodded, resigned. With ropes tied to their waists, lanterns raised high, the 5 men entered the black throat of Stonewell Cavern. The ground beneath them was slick, the air tightening instantly, as though stone pressed itself against their ribs, squeezing each fragile breath. Behind them, the villagers waited at the tree-line, every heart leaning forward, waiting for discovery or scream. For the valley had decided at last. This was not just waiting for hunger to strike again. This time they would strike back. But in Stonewell Cavern, no man entered without being changed. The first steps into Stonewell Cavern were slow, deliberate, and heavy with dread. The 5 men moved cautiously, their lanterns slicing only narrow arcs into the dense dark. The opening swallowed them whole almost instantly, sealing them from the sight of the villagers at the tree line. Behind them, that faint sliver of daylight seemed smaller with every breath, and soon it was nothing but memory. Inside, the air hit them like a wall, thick, cold, metallic. Each inhalation was laced with the taste of rust, as though they breathed blood itself. Moisture clung to their hair, to their coats. The cavern walls wept with condensation, trailing down black stone that seemed too smooth, too deliberate to be shaped by nature. The entrance chamber was narrow, forcing them to duck as they moved deeper. Lantern light revealed markings etched along both sides, carving lines into the stone that curled and twisted in patterns none could name. Some were sharp and geometric, others curved like shattered spirals bending against themselves. The more they stared, the less their eyes seemed to agree on the shapes. Henry ran his gloved fingers over one deep groove and jerked them back as though burned. "They're warm," he muttered, voice trembling. His eyes darted between the others, seeking confirmation. No one doubted him. The deeper they pushed, the more the sound returned. That same steady rhythm, low and pulsing through the stone, not quite heard, not quite felt, vibrating in skull bones like a hidden drum. It seemed to come from the very walls, from beneath their boots, from inside their chests even. Their strides grew quicker at first, as though chasing the source, but soon slowed again with the realization that it never grew louder. The sound was everywhere and nowhere. Jeremiah's prayers stumbled from his mouth, broken and uneven. His sling of rosary beads clattered against his lantern handle, loud in the thick silence. Andrew snapped at him to be quiet, but even his harsh whisper seemed swallowed before it could carry, muffled by the oppressive air. They reached the first chamber not long after, a hollow space where the ceiling vaulted higher, carved smooth like a dome. Here, pools of stagnant water reflected their light, yet the reflections twisted unnaturally, wavering even when lanterns held steady. The pools rippled as though disturbed, though no drop of water had fallen. Thomas knelt, staring close, then recoiled, swearing he saw his own reflection delayed, his mouth moving moments after he had already spoken. From the far side of the chamber, tunnels branched off. Narrow slots in the walls, darker than black, each large enough for a man to crawl through if he dared. The men exchanged glances, dread tightening every face at the thought. The cavern branched like a body's veins, endless, labyrinthine. "Choose one," Henry whispered finally. "We stick together." They settled on the left passage, marking their wall with chalk from Henry's pouch. Lanterns brushed barely an arm's length in front as they pressed forward, squeezing single file through the tight throat. Air thinned, growing colder. Their breaths came faster, fog curling from lips and quickly fading in the dark. Somewhere deep within, a sound broke the rhythm. Footsteps. Clear. Sharp. Echoing against stone. All five froze. Andrew raised his lantern swiftly, light quivering against the walls. The tunnel lay empty, yet the steps persisted, slow, deliberate, approaching. Then they stopped. Owen hearts throbbed loud, a drum of fear. From behind them came another noise. Not steps, a scrape, like stone dragging against stone. Deliberate, slow, heavier than any foot could bear. Henry gripped his hammer, knuckles pale. "Keep moving. Do not stop." His whisper was taut, breaking under weight. They pressed forward with urgency, scraping shoulders against the cold rock walls until the passage widened unexpectedly, spilling them into a vast interior chamber. Their lantern lights stretched only partially across, but they could see stone structures rising from the cavern floor, pillars carved not by nature but by hands. They were aligned in crude circles, their surfaces etched with grooves and markings that flashed faintly under the flame. The men stopped at once, unable to mistake what they saw. This was not cavern alone. This was design. At the chamber's center lay a hollow pit, just deep enough to swallow light completely. None could see its bottom. The humming rhythm pulsed louder here, vibrating directly beneath their boots, a dreadful throbbing like the cavern's own heartbeat. Jeremiah sank to his knees, clutching his beads, whispering words that sounded less like prayer and more like begging. Thomas edged closer to the pit, raising his lantern and craning it over. His hand trembled. "There's something," he choked suddenly, stumbling back, so violently he nearly dropped his flame. "What did you see?" Henry demanded. Thomas's voice broke. Faces. Not carved, not stone. Faces staring, pressed into the rock like they were swallowed alive. The others shifted instinctively back, eyes darting to the pit but refusing to lean near. Lantern light wasn't strong enough to confirm, yet the fear in Thomas's voice was louder than proof. Then came the sound again. Footsteps. This time not echoing. Close. Too close. Lantern light flickered against the far side of the circle. A shape stood just outside the glow. Human, or was it? A figure, still, upright. A man's frame. But no features. Where the face should have been, there was only blankness, stone-smooth skin, no mouth, no eyes. It moved. Andrew shouted, his voice cracking in terror as he raised his pick. But the figure stepped backward rather than forward, retreating into dark as though melting into stone. The footsteps ceased instantly. The five stood frozen, each uncertain if they had truly seen or merely imagined under fear. But the silence pressed too tight, too heavy. Henry broke first. "We go no deeper tonight." His voice trembled, but command surged back briefly. "We mark our way. We leave while we can. Tomorrow we decide again." None argued. They scrambled fast through the tight passages, choking on shallow breath, lanterns jerking wild against walls. Every moment, they anticipated steps behind them or whispers against a stone. But no sound came. At last, the thin glow of daylight reappeared. They stumbled out of Stonewell's mouth with faces pale, eyes hollow, bodies trembling, so weakly some nearly collapsed. The waiting villagers rushed closer, desperate for answers. But none spoke a word. The cavern had let them leave. That was answer enough. And deep inside, beyond the pit, beyond the endless tunnels, the rhythm continued. Louder now, as though it had been stirred, as though it was waking. When the 5 men staggered back into the pale light of morning, the villagers at the tree line rushed to meet them. But what they found only deepened their dread. The explorers returned whole in body, yet broken in manner. Their faces were drained of all color, and their eyes, though fixed forward, seemed to look through people rather than at them. They did not speak as they emerged, not even to reassure their wives or children. They stood with lanterns still flickering in their hands, shoulders sagging as though carrying a weight invisible to the rest. Henry Lowe, usually a man of iron voice, said nothing. Jeremiah Quinn, the preacher, clutched his rosary with bloodied fingers as if he had been clutching it too tightly, digging nail into flesh. Andrew Wilkes refused to meet the gaze of anyone around him. Caleb Foster stared only at the ground. And Thomas Grady, though his lips trembled with the desire to speak, stopped himself again and again, swallowing back words as though they might turn poisonous if loosed. Murmurs spread quickly through the crowd. Had they seen inside? Had they found the missing? Had the cavern spat back some fragment of truth? But the silence of the 5 was answer enough. If there was truth beneath the stone, it was one that words could not bear. That night, the men did not return to their beds. Each retreated to their cabins, bolting doors, sitting by half-burnt lanterns that guttered long past the hour of sleep. Their wives swore later that they never once closed their eyes until daylight burned through. Even then, they woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, eyes wide, heart hammering, haunted not by dreams, but by memory. By the week's end, the change spread outward. The valley had always been a place of silence, interrupted only by the natural rhythms of forest life, wind weaving through fir branches, owls in the night, the distant rush of rivers across stone. But now the silence was different. It was not quiet. It was absence. The kinds of noises that should have been there simply ceased. No birdsong broke morning. Hunting dogs fell silent mid-howl, ears pinned, eyes fixed toward the ridge, as if recognizing something their masters could not. The livestock grew skittish. Horses snorted and refused to graze, staring with rolling eyes into the woods. Sheep pressed themselves against fences until boards cracked beneath their weight, panicked by nothing visible. More than one farmer found his animals dead in the morning, untouched by bite or blade, simply lifeless, their eyes wide as though frightened to death. Neighbors began finding strange marks on their doors each dawn, carved small into the wood, scratches that matched the twisted shapes Henry and Thomas had seen in the cavern. None could explain how they appeared, for no hand had been seen at work in the night. But each day, more markings multiplied, stretching across fences, wagons, the very frames of houses. Jeremiah finally stood before the church to speak, though his voice was frayed. He admitted what the others feared confirming. The cavern was not dormant anymore. Their steps had stirred something. Their presence had pulled the weight of its awareness to the surface. They had gone below, and in returning, had carried it back with them. But his words did not inspire faith. Instead, it spread division. Some shouted that the men should not have gone, that every evil now pouring into their valley was of their making, punishment for curiosity. Others challenged him back, demanding that facing the terror was the only option that remained. The shouting grew until families left in furious silence, retreating behind bolted doors. And still, each night, the phenomena deepened. Lights no longer appeared only at the ridge. Now they flickered in the fields, small glows that roamed like curious lanterns across pasture and forest alike. Men staked themselves on porches with rifles, determined to shoot if source revealed itself. But no shot was fired, for every time the shapes drifted close enough to glimpse, the watchers faltered in terror. They swore the lights had form, not lamps, not torches, but eyes, burning white, disembodied, floating just above the earth. Children stopped playing. Laughter died entirely. In its place came cries in the night, confused screams of little ones waking to voices calling from outside in the dark. Many mothers stood guard over their children till morning, clutching them tight, whispering promises no one believed anymore. Henry Lowe grew worse. His neighbors claimed to hear him hammering in the smithy at all hours, long past the time he should have rested. But when they approached, the sound stopped before they reached the door. One man who dared to enter found Henry standing over an anvil, pupil-black eyes fixed on symbols he carved into sheets of iron with his tools. The shapes were jagged, familiar, forms from the cavern's walls. He insisted he didn't remember doing it. Andrew Wilkes, always resentful and quick to anger, began raving at night, stumbling drunk into the square, yelling that something followed him. His voice shredded into screams against the empty ridge. Caleb Foster disappeared for a full day before stumbling back from the forest blank-eyed, unable to explain where he had been. Most disturbing of all was Thomas Grady. One dawn, his wife found him standing barefoot in the frost, his lantern shattered around him, glass glittering like ice. He was weeping, but his voice was not his own. He muttered words low and guttural, chants that he didn't recognize afterward, but that others swore matched the rhythm heard deep within Stonewell. The cavern had marked them, and something inside was bleeding into the valley with them as vessel. The villagers now faced a truth they had long feared but tried not to name. The cavern would not need to swallow them whole anymore. It was already walking among them, in voices that weren't theirs, in eyes that no longer blinked right, in marks spreading like a language written across their homes. And each night the rhythm deepened, louder, closer, as though it had only been waiting for a door to open. And 5 men had opened it. By the spring of 1892, the valley was no longer alive in any true sense. It moved, it breathed, but like a body stricken by sickness, it did not thrive. The air hung heavy with the taste of iron, so sharp that every mouthful of bread seemed tainted by it. The forests, once a chorus of birds, wind, and water, were silent as a grave. And the people, gaunt and haggard, spoke to each other with the suspicion of strangers. The cavern had done more than steal men, women, and livestock. It had stolen trust. Every morning, new stories broke apart whatever slender calm remained. Families awoke to discover the marks growing larger on their homes, now curling into overlapping circles like nests. Others swore they found dirt scattered across their floors, as though footprints had trailed inside. But there were no broken windows, no battered doors. The strange lights continued to drift at night, closer now, circling cabins like predators sizing up their prey. More than one family admitted that the lights sometimes paused in their windows, hanging there, 2 glowing orbs, like eyes staring in. And then came the first vanishing from within. It was Dorothy Quinn, Jeremiah's eldest daughter. She was 12 years old, and she went to bed like any other night. At dawn, her parents found her bed empty, her quilt folded neatly back, as though she had risen by choice. But her shoes remained by the door. Her shawl still hung on its peg. No footprints crossed the dirt outside, and no one in the family had heard a sound. Dorothy had vanished as though the darkness itself had reached in and taken her. The news broke the village. For many, this was worse than the hunters lost in the ridges, worse than Samuel, even worse than the animals that died mysteriously. For Stonewell had crossed a line. It had not lured anymore. It had taken from inside their very walls, without trace, leaving nothing behind but silence. Panic tore through the valley. Mothers sat weeping at the church gates. Fathers patrolled day and night with rifles they no longer believed mattered. And whispers turned to accusation. Neighbors questioning neighbors, convinced someone among them drew the cavern's hunger closer. By then, the 5 men who had descended into Stonewell were treated as marked. The villagers did not speak it outright, but their eyes revealed it every time they passed them. Fear bled into resentment. If the cavern had spread like sickness, then surely those who carried its breath inside were carriers. It was in Henry's hammering, Thomas's chanting in his sleep, Jeremiah's trembling silence, Andrew's raving, Caleb's absences. And so suspicion grew into anger. On a cold morning in April, a crowd gathered outside Henry's smithy. Torches in hand, they demanded he leave. His iron carvings of strange symbols had spread, marking every piece of metal he touched. They claimed he was drawing the cavern closer, whether knowingly or not. Henry stepped into the doorway, stood on his face, hammer in his hand, trembling. But rather than deny, he fell into silence, eyes hollow, lips shutting against the crowd as if even he feared what had taken root in him. The townsfolk did not harm him that day, but their message was clear. His neighbors no longer saw him as one of them. He was part of the cavern now. The same fate followed the others. Andrew had stones thrown at his cabin after he screamed through the night at shadows no one else saw. Caleb's fields lay abandoned, weeds choking rows of corn, but no one dared step near his property anymore. Jeremiah faced the cruelest fate of all. Families left his church, pews emptied. His wife shunned when she went to the well. The preacher who had once cried warnings was now called cursed. The community turned inward, shutting doors not only on the cavern, but on each other. And yet, Stonewell thrived in isolation. For soon, those who hid behind barred doors realized bars meant nothing. The disappearances became more frequent. Always the same: a bed empty at dawn, a chair left rocking, tools still warm from work. No forced entry, no sound in the night. Men, women, children, vanishing without resistance. And still no bodies, no blood, no trace. Families evaporated, scattered across the valley like dust blown through cracks. At night, the chanting grew louder. No longer muffled, it throbbed through the very ground. Houses vibrated faintly, glasses trembling on shelves, lantern flames quivering. And people began to recognize words, though they had never learned the language. Some swore they heard their own names within the rhythm, spoken low and drawn out, as though the cavern itself were calling, summoning. Paranoia boiled into madness. Spouses accused one another. Neighbors fought in the square, fists breaking teeth, shouting that someone, anyone, was aligned with the cavern, drawing its hunger. Families barricaded themselves in. Others fled into the woods, never to return, leaving huts half-burned or abandoned, fields untended and collapsing. What made it worse was the emptiness spreading across the land. The nearer one lived to the ridge, the more the earth seemed wrong. Milk soured in buckets hours after milking. Bread molded overnight. Crops withered in soil that seemed blackened despite no frost touching it. And the air always that metallic tang, heavier with every week until villagers gagged with each breath. By midsummer, the valley had lost too many to keep count. No longer were names spoken. They were swallowed as soon as lips formed them, crossing immediately into silence. Some cabins stood shuttered, never opened again, deserted entirely though smoke still rose from their chimneys. Others still looked lived in, yet no voices ever emerged. One night in July, a family swore they saw Samuel Hawthorne, the boy taken the year before, standing in their field. His face pale, his movements slow, his eyes empty as hollow sockets though nothing was missing from them. He did not respond when called. He only turned back toward the ridge and walked into the mist. That sealed it. Stonewell was no longer a cavern. It was a mouth that fed and regurgitated, stealing not only bodies but warping them, sending them back wrong. The valley became a husk, its people fractured, its land spoiled, its nights unbearable, its days thick with fog that never lifted. No one remembered the last time they heard true silence. For even in daylight, even when the air seemed calm, somewhere underneath, the rhythm continued. Always steady, always closer. The people of the valley knew one truth in their bones. They were living not beside the cavern, but inside its reach. And every moment that passed, its hunger deepened. The breaking point was near. And when it came, it would not be quiet. Chapter 9, the collapse. By late 1892, the valley stood on the edge of ruin. Entire homesteads lay abandoned, fields withered. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys that once carried bread smells and warmth. What remained of the community clung together in ragged numbers, weary and half-wild with fear. Every night now brought vanishings. No pattern, no mercy. Old men disappeared from their chairs by the hearth. Infants disappeared from cradles beside sleeping mothers. Tools vanished from hands, cattle from pastures. And each loss deepened the chanting that rolled beneath their feet, louder, more insistent, as though the cavern's appetite swelled with each feeding. The survivors could no longer deny that Stonewell had become more than hunger. It was dominance. So when the last true gathering was called, it was not out of hope, but out of desperation. The villagers crowded into the square one dusk, their faces haggard, their eyes haunted. Lanterns swung from poles, casting light over fearful expressions, and fists clenched around useless tools. The preacher Jeremiah Quinn stood among them, though scarcely a preacher anymore. His voice was weak, his frame bent with grief after his daughter Dorothy had been taken. But still, his words carried the weight of finality. "It is no longer waiting," he rasped. "It's here. It's always here. And unless we face it fully, there will be nothing left to save." But what did facing mean now? Some argued for fire, for stacking wood and pitch around the cavern's mouth, burning until smoke suffocated everything within. Some demanded dynamite, collapsing the ridges onto themselves. Others shouted that to strike Stonewell was suicide. What survived from inside would not forgive. The arguments boiled into chaos, voices nodding together in anger and grief. And then Henry Lowe stepped forward, the blacksmith who had first cried for action. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but his voice cut sharper than iron. "Tomorrow," he said, "we end it. Whatever it is, we face it in its heart. No more waiting to be picked clean." The murmur quieted. Even those who despised Henry feared but could not deny him. There was nothing else left. At dawn, the last march began. No more than 24 souls remained willing or desperate enough to follow. Men carried rifles, picks, and lanterns. Women clutched knives meant for kitchen tables, but raised like weapons. Children remained behind, hidden with elders in the farthest cabins, though many doubted those walls offered safety. The column moved in silence through trees muted by fog, heading once more for the ridge that had broken their lives. The cavern stood waiting, unchanged yet impossibly present. The maw gaped, jagged teeth of stone lining an opening from which cold breath poured in steady torrents. The chanting could be heard clearly now, even before they crossed into shadow, pulsing, constant, vibrating in their bones, as though they were part of its choir already. At the tree line, several faltered, fear paralyzing their steps. Some turned back, fleeing into woods, without shame. Only a fraction remained. Henry, Jeremiah, Andrew, Caleb, and Thomas among the front, faces painted by lantern light, their courage a brittle thing held together by despair. They entered as one. The cavern swallowed them eagerly. Walls slick with condensation closed them in, voices vibrating closer with every step. The markings along the stone shimmered faintly, as though feeding on the lantern's glow, glowing back with pale reflections. By the time they reached the central chamber, the rhythm had grown deafening. But now the chamber was not as it had been before. The circle of carved pillars flickered with movement. Shadows shuddered across their faces even when no lantern swung. The pit at the center pulsed like a wound. From within, light glimmered faintly, sickly, white, rising slowly like embers floating in reverse. Faces did stare back faintly, just as Thomas had sworn, their features twisted and grotesque, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with eternal horror. The villagers formed their circle at the chamber's edge, weapons raised as though they mattered. Henry raised his hammer, Andrew his pick, Jeremiah holding aloft his rosary, as if its beads might strike like flame. Then the voices broke into clarity. Not chants anymore, words. Harsh, guttural syllables, fractured but undeniable. They were not sung by echoes, but carried by shapes that unfurled from walls themselves. Figures emerged. At first they looked like stone men, blank-faced, eyeless, their bodies rough as limestone carved in haste. But they moved fluidly, arms stretching, shoulders turning with deliberate weight. Their faceless heads swiveled toward the intruders in perfect unison. The villagers froze. A hiss rose from the pit, and the first figure stepped down, its feet grinding yet leaving no sound. More followed, half a dozen, pouring from the stone itself, as though they had always been part of it. Blankness stared at flesh. Silence pressed tight before the rhythm began again, this time with the cadence of steps. Panic broke. Some fired rifles. The shots cracked thunder into the cavern, iron slugs smacking into blank stone skins. One figure staggered backward, chips of rock falling from its torso. But it did not stop. It pressed forward, arms reaching, hands blank but heavy. Screams tore the air. Andrew swung his pick wildly, smashing it into the nearest form. The rock splintered, the shape cracking apart. But behind it, more emerged, crawling from the pit, like insects from a nest, endless, faceless, unstoppable. The villagers fled in chaos, running not for fight, but for raw survival. Lanterns shattered, fire spilled into slick water pools, smoke rising in a haze thick enough to choke. Some leapt blindly into tunnels. Others shrieked as faceless hands closed around their limbs. Henry struck and struck again with his hammer, each blow sparking against unyielding stone. Jeremiah clutched his rosary, shouting words of prayer drowned beneath the roar. But the cavern was louder. What lived within did not bow to names of God. For every figure broken, two more came. For every scream silenced, another was taken into echo. The cavern's heartbeat grew deafening, flooding with triumph as though the nightmare pulse was laughing. Those who ran for daylight found the exit narrowing, the stone shifting impossibly, tightening, mawing shut around them. Some managed to squeeze through, gulping screams into daylight drenched with fog. Many did not. Outside, the watchers waiting at the tree line heard everything. The screams, the gunshots, the clattering echoes rolling from within. And then silence. Only silence. The cavern exhaled one final gust of cold wind, pushing lanterns' smoke outward across the ridge. Then it returned to stillness, its black mouth yawning quiet once more. Of those who entered, fewer than half returned. Even those staggered pale, bloodied, and broken, their eyes empty to self. They did not talk. They did not rest. They only drifted back toward their cabins, shadows of the people they once were. The valley realized then what the men had awakened was not fightable, not stoppable. Stonewell was not a place to be confronted. It was a force that bent every rule, that could only take, feed, and spread. The collapse was complete, for the cavern had shown its truth. No one entered without leaving part of themselves behind. And the valley, whether they knew yet or not, belonged to Stonewell now. By the winter of 1892, the valley was no longer a place that belonged to the living. What survivors remained after the collapse of that final, desperate attempt drifted half-conscious through their days, shadows of themselves, marked beyond recovery. Homes still stood, but they hummed with emptiness. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. The fields lay blackened, as though soil itself had surrendered. Those who survived the cavern's grasp no longer tended land or cared for animals. They wandered hollow-eyed, muttering words that made no sense, rhythms that frightened their neighbors more than silence ever had. Within months, families packed what little they could and fled the mountains. They left their cabins behind, barns locked, wagons abandoned mid-path. Some made it to distant towns, where they spoke feverishly of disappearances, of lights in the woods, of a cavern that stole not only flesh but spirit. Most who listened dismissed their stories, branding them mad from grief, mountain folk broken under their own superstition. But those who truly watched their eyes, the hollow, the haunted, knew that something had carved them deeper than sorrow ever could. By spring, the valley was empty. No laughter, no cries, no hymns rising from the church. Only the buildings remained, sagging slowly into decay as vines crawled their frames and storms stripped their roofs. The forest pressed closer, overtaking fields, swallowing paths, reclaiming in months what had taken decades to clear. And above it all the ridge stood silent, its black mouth always open, waiting. Stonewell Cavern had no need to strike further. It had won. Travelers who passed through the Ozarks in the years that followed told strange stories if they wandered close. Tales of cabins abandoned mid-meal, chairs tipped to tables, quilts folded neatly, but beds empty. Of goats and cattle found bones slick in fields, untouched by scavengers. Of voices rising faintly from the hills at night, not the call of owls or wolves, but human voices, low and layered, chanting words no one understood. Some swore they saw shapes crossing the ridges at dusk, figures walking slowly, eyes glowing faint in the last light before dark. Others passed months later and found no signs at all, as though the valley itself had swallowed memory. By then, roads leading inward had faded beneath growth and disuse. Few returned twice. In time, the story spread as legend. Locals shook their heads when asked, warning strangers off with half-hearted smiles, muttering about cursed land best forgotten. Children were told never to climb too deep into the ridges, never to wander after dusk. And in whispers, the cavern's name carried still, Stonewell. By the turn of the century, the valley had ceased to exist on maps. Settlers spoke of it vaguely, as though memory itself fought against recalling. Timbermen and hunters sometimes claimed to stumble across the ridge, though rarely more than once. Those who pressed closer admitted to feeling watched, to hearing soft knocks through the ground beneath their boots. Some left tokens behind in fear, coins, food, trinkets, like offerings. And those who did not heed their dread often simply never returned. What remained of the original families was scattered, their bloodlines absorbed quietly into other towns far from the Ozarks. On storm-heavy nights, some descendants muttered of dreams filled with faceless shapes, of doorframes marked by strange symbols, of voices reciting words they had never learned, but woke knowing with dread. Though they lived miles, even states away, the cavern's reach seemed endless, carried within them like seed. And through every retelling, every whisper, one detail never changed. No bodies were ever found. Elias Carter, Jonathan Pike, William Boone, Samuel Hawthorne, Dorothy Quinn, Margaret Wilkes, dozens more. Not one grave bore their names. They had not died in the hills. They had been taken. The Ozarks absorbed Stonewell Cavern into its folklore, but always with distance. Always a warning, never a tale to entertain. Some called it a curse, others a punishment. Many named it simply a hunger, endless, patient, and incorruptible. For if there was one truth the valley left behind, it was this: the cavern could not be conquered. Its walls bled silence. Its voice was older than any faith prayed against it. It took men, women, children, animals, and earth alike, erasing them without mercy, without trace, without explanation. Faceless echoes roamed its depths, and those who brushed against it never left whole. And so the valley story ended, not in triumph, not in survival, but in abandonment. No man lives there now, but the cavern does. Always the cavern. There are rumors even now of those brave or foolish enough to seek it. Explorers drawn to forgotten ridges, historians searching the absence of names, wanderers hoping to prove folklore false. Few find it. Fewer admit it when they do. And those who return never come back unchanged. For Stonewell Cavern lies waiting. Its maw never sealed, its silence never filled. And in the Ozark Mountains, if you listen on cold nights when mist hangs low and the trees hold breath, you can still hear it, the steady rhythm beneath the ground. A heartbeat not your own.
Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.